It's time to dive back into the Resident Evil series with Resident Evil Village. I was really excited to play this game after playing RE7 last year. I was really looking forward to it. I was really craving some more Resident Evil first-person horror action gameplay, and I've waited so much information about Resident Evil Village, so I was really going into this with a fresh mindset of wanting to experience everything that the game had to offer. First up, the PC port. I would say that the PC port is lacking, especially for a AAA game. The settings menu is unintuitive with weird menu keybinds. It just feels like a chore to interact with, just feels so unintuitive to navigate around. In true Capcom fashion, they just missed the mark with the settings menu. It's missing essential features like the FOV slider. I can't believe that we were in 2023 when this game released and it did not have a FOV slider, and the FOV is so low in the game. It was really hard to stomach after the first couple of hours, to the point where I had to mod an FOV slider in, and the game worked flawlessly with a higher FOV. There was no issues with animations. The game didn't suffer because of it. It just felt like developer stubbornness and lack of accessibility, that there isn't one in the game. Every first-person game should have an FOV slider so people like myself don't suffer from ridiculously low FOV headaches. Other than that, the game ran pretty well. It did have a few stutters in a few areas and frame drops in others. I know the game did suffer at launch from a lot of headaches for some people, but at this point in the game, it is fairly stable. There is a few hiccups throughout the experience, but it is overall pretty good. The game looks really good, but I would say the environments are the standout. There was a lot of visuals in this game that were really, really cool to look at. It just seems like in so many of these games, the environmental artists really are the ones that are just the heroes of the piece, and this game is no different. The character models are also really good. A lot of fun little details in a lot of them. Overall, I'd say it looks better than RE7. They are going for a totally different aesthetic here, but if I had to compare the two, I'd say RE7 does the horror aesthetic much better, while Resident Evil Village does the environments and character models in higher fidelity. Whether or not that's a plus or minus to you is entirely up to you. The story is pretty good, but I will say for me it felt very disjointed from Resident Evil 7. It kind of felt like they wanted to use this story setting in particular and kind of just like jammed a round peg into a square hole, just like had to make it work. There was tie-ins to the previous games, but it felt like we just completely took a left turn from the last game and just ended up in Antarctica. I do appreciate where we ended up. It led to some interesting story moments and some really cool environments and theming, but it just feels a bit disjointed from the previous game. It was fun and engaging throughout the entire game, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was a little strange and disjointed. It went off the rails at the end in major Resident Evil fashion, but did manage to stick to the landing just barely for me. I have a few issues with the story overall, but I feel like it did conclude in a satisfying way for this story. I will say, as a minor nitpick, I think the game suffered by not wanting to show Ethan's face. It does that thing where they want to have a faceless protagonist, but they have an established character. Like, Ethan is in the Resident Evil mythos now. He's an important character. I think the game should have embraced showing the character's face more so they weren't left in situations where they felt like they had to dance around it, in my opinion. I will say I really enjoyed the characters in this game. All the big personalities from the bosses and other supporting cast were really fun, and they all felt unique and were well performed, and I felt they suited the game really well. Heisenberg, of course, is a standout. I feel like he's a fan favorite from the game. A lot of people like Lady Dimitrescu for a reason, I guess, and I knew about the memes and all the comments beforehand. And I will say, while I appreciated her character, I liked Heisenberg a lot more. The gameplay has a fun loop of exploring, collecting currency and upgrades, and feeding that back into upgrading your character, leading back into more collectibles, leading back into selling things from upgrades. It was just a fun gameplay loop of exploring the environments, finding cool collectibles, and then being able to use those to upgrade your character with better equipment. I really like that loop in games, and Village has a really good balance of those systems. The map is really fun to explore, really well laid out. Again, props to the environment design team. And I really like the map and collectible system where you can see on the map, you can see which areas have collectibles that you haven't collected yet. And then when you go to that area and find the collectible, it changes color, letting you know that you've found everything in that area, so you don't have to go hunting around for other things. I like that system so much. I want other games to implement this. This would be great in like massive games when you're hunting around for small little collectibles and you don't know if you found all the collectibles in one area and not in another. It's just a good system that I feel like more games should implement more. Overall, I feel like the game is a good first-person shooter. It's a good first-person action game, but it feels less like a horror game and much more like an action game this time around. There were still a few horror moments that stood out, but it was much more action set pieces. I feel like they wanted a different tone from this game. It was much more campy. It relied a lot more on jump scares, which was a bit disappointing. I know there were some jump scares in the last game, but this game felt like it relied on them a lot more, and it was less tension and build up for the horror in those moments. It's a good action loop for a shooter, but it didn't escalate any of the horror from the last game, which was a bit disappointing. The last thing I'll say is the enemy AI is very easy to exploit and didn't feel very threatening. A lot of the ads that you come across during the game, the werewolves and the smaller enemies, they just didn't seem very threatening. I was genuinely creeped out by the enemies in Resident Evil 7 to the point where like they grossed me out and it was kind of uncomfortable to fight them, and it was creepy to run across them in different scenarios. In this game, they weren't very threatening, and the AI was just kind of so dumb that I could just lure them into chaining headshots or getting blasted in the face to a shotgun. There wasn't any variation to their tactics or anything like that to make the game challenging. It was just kind of like I was fighting dumb grunts throughout most of the game. The bosses added a bit of variety, but a lot of them were just tanky, where you just had to run around and shoot them in the face a bunch of times, which is classic Resident Evil tactics, but I was kind of hoping for a little bit more variety there. Overall, it was a decently fun experience. It was not as tight of an overall experience as Resident Evil 7, and it definitely wasn't the kind of game that I expected, leaning more into the action genre than the horror genre, but it was a fun, campy action shooter that I had a lot of fun with, exploring all of the map, finding all the upgrades, and there is a decent amount of gameplay variety to keep you going if you're not interested in the story. So overall, I really enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to the next game, although I do hope that it does return to a bit more of the horror roots of the franchise. SpellForce 2 is an odd game. It's published by THQ Nordic, and I'm a pretty big THQ fan. I've liked a lot of the games that they've published over the years, and this game being a mix of an RPG and an RTS kind of sold it on me. So I figured I'd give it a try and see how well of a balance they struck between those two types of games. And I was left with mixed feelings on the overall experience. First up, the PC port is okay for the age of the game. It's an older game, it crashes occasionally, it doesn't like to alt-tab, and it performs okay at max settings. There's a lot of effects on screen, a lot of units doing different things, so I feel like when it does tank in huge battle scenes, it's not that big of a deal because you can see where most of the performance is going. So I wasn't too disappointed with the performance of the game, but there was some resistance there when playing it. It wasn't a perfectly smooth experience, but for an old game, it ran reasonably well and it didn't crash every 5 minutes, so I'll give it props there. A lot of old games are just so difficult to get running these days that when you get something this old that actually runs semi-decent, it's a bonus. It has WASD movement as default, which is fantastic for a game, especially of its age. A lot of games like this don't. They rely on weird control schemes, and this one is just simple and intuitive, which felt great. It felt like it was putting its best foot forward. The art style is really nice. It looks great for its age with really good detail in the model work and really pretty environments. It reminds me a lot of Age of Empires 3. The visual art style is very similar in a lot of areas there, and for that it gets a lot of points for me. I love Age of Empires 3. I grew up playing that game along with the other Age of the Empires games, and just that blocky, chunky art style really sold it to me. It looks fantastic. Unfortunately, that's about all of the good I can give the game. Everything else here is kind of a bit of a more of a negative impression. I realize this is a nostalgic game for a lot of people growing up with this franchise. I did play a little bit of the first game, but that game I had a lot more problems with even over this game, so I kind of just played a little bit of that to get the feel for it and then skipped on to the second one because I really wasn't a fan of much of the things that the first one was doing. Overall, I think it looks better, runs better, and controls better than the first game, but it's not a very high high bar in my opinion. The UI isn't great, and the controls for the RTS section of the game, which you will spend a lot of time using, are not great. Being able to control a large amount of units is very clunky. Being able to organize them in combat is very clunky. A lot of the UI-based systems are just clunky. I recognize this is an older game where everything wasn't standardized and seamless. Back then, everything was very personalized to each game, but it feels like there was a lot of areas they could have made the game a bit more seamless and a little bit more intuitive. Sadly, they did not. When you get into a large scale battle and you have a large group of people, like a large group of units, it really just becomes a huge cluster fudge of effects, and you completely lose the ability to micromanage all of your party in that huge mess. So I found that was really annoying, and the game has a lot of huge maps with a lot of big battles, so a lot of the time you're struggling to get the fine control that you want out of your gameplay. The pathfinding is horrible, with characters constantly getting stuck on other characters in the environment. You can't disengage from a lot of fights because of this. A lot of units just feel like they're moving in slow motion a lot of the time, so you kind of have to commit to big maneuvers, and it's really hard to change tactics on the fly, unfortunately, which is a huge part of playing an RTS game, is being able to react to things when they happen in real time. And for this game, the pace just goes right down in combat, where you kind of just have to stick it out and hope you win, otherwise you reload your last save. As I mentioned before, the mix of an RPG and an RTS is an interesting idea, but unfortunately it doesn't succeed in either of those. The RPG side of things is kind of unplayable because, as I said, you control a lot of characters, so zooming in to control your one singular party when you're surrounded by everyone else is just kind of useless. There's not a lot of missions in the game where you're running around by yourself. A lot of the time you're surrounded by huge armies, so then you're forced into the RTS side of things, and then, as I've outlined earlier, a lot of the RTS stuff is so clunky that it just drags that down as well. So I feel like it doesn't really succeed in either of them, despite having lofty goals in both of them. The maps are huge, and you need to see so much of them. You need to use a lot of them to beat the conditions of each map. Like, sometimes an entire mission will take you a couple of hours to completely explore, and the game expects you to do all of that. So the pace of the game is all over the place. A majority of it is just so slow. It's also very repetitive. A lot of the missions and a lot of the chapters of the game are basically just build up an army, destroy the enemy base, move on to the next map, spend the next 3 hours doing that all over again. Build up an army, make a base, move to the enemy base, destroy theirs, and move on. A lot of the time, that's what you'll be doing throughout this game, and this game is a long game as well. It's not a short campaign. You will be doing a lot of the same things over and over and over, which would be fine in other RTS games because they have a huge variety of units and technologies and factions, but in this game, you have different factions, and they do have a few unique abilities and units, but they don't have a lot of variety in buildings, technology upgrades. There's just not a lot of stuff there. You're just building the same things over and over and over every single map, making the same units, using the same strategies. It just feels very repetitive. There's just not a lot of variety here to keep the game interesting over a long campaign. A lot of old RTS games split campaigns into different chunks with different factions to make it feel fresh and have different strengths and weaknesses. This game just feels like every faction is just a reskin of another faction, with severely lacking in variety of gameplay. Another couple of things to mention here before I move on: the companions aren't really that interesting. I didn't connect with any of them at all. They kind of just have their moment, and then you move on, and you get so many companions in this game that they just kind of feel like people that were there with you without any personality. The story I completely bounced off of. It didn't grip me in any way. I kind of just felt like I was going through the motions in different areas just to push the game forwards. Your main character is a huge dick, so it's hard to connect with him at all. He feels like he's severely lacking as a main character, with basically no emotion throughout the entire game, so it's hard to feel any connection with him. Therefore, it's hard to connect with the story that he's experiencing. The loot is very boring, with any interesting gear to look at. It's basically just follow the numbers, upgrade the thing that gives you the highest stats, and that's it. There's not a lot of time to get attached to any gear because it's all pretty boring. Leveling up is pretty bland because the skill tree is completely uninteresting. It's a mandatory upgrade, so you either go through combat or magic, and if you go through either of them, you have to level up in a specific way to get up to the higher upgrades, so it just feels like it's very forced upon you. There's no great build variety here. It's just commit to magic or combat. Voice acting is hilariously bad. Sometimes it's funny, sometimes it's just boring. Most of the time, it's just bad. Overall, I feel like the devs were trying to innovate in this area by mixing these two genres, but you really have to commit here. You can't half-ass it with either of them, and both areas just feel so lacking that it's really hard to recommend this game. I am going to continue the series. I do want to see if it improves in the third game, because I hear that game has mixed reviews, so I want to see if this game compares to that game in any comparable way. But as for this game, I think only play it if you're really interested in experiencing a clunky RPG/RTS game. Finishing off the month with Showgunners. I was really happy to be playing a game that I enjoyed again. This game was really fun. It's just a straight up turn-based action game, and I had a lot of fun with it. The PC port is good, lots of options there for customization. The game ran well for me, no crashes, performed well. The game looked great with a really slick art style and fun presentation, lots of color, lots of bright lights to keep you interested, and the environments really popped with the art style. Overall, this game was really pleasant to look at, and I had a ton of fun doing so. The combat is really punchy and satisfying, which is good because there is a lot of combat in this game. This game is 99% combat. The rest of the game is puzzles and a slight bit of dialogue, but other than that, it is gory, fun, punchy combat, which I really enjoyed. Turn-based games can get really slow and boring, but this one had really good pacing and a fun premise. If you're into cyberpunk games with dystopian futures, this game might be right up your alley. It had some fun characters. The story wasn't crazy, but it was enough to keep you going throughout the story. I was interested to see where it was going. It did kind of fall apart towards the end, but I don't mind too much. The story was campy. It was playing on a lot of tropes from this genre, and in the end, it really was just about the gameplay. The pacing of companions was a bit all over the place. You get a smattering of companions throughout the game, and a couple of them get shoved at you right at the end, so it's hard to connect with them. They do have some dialogue and some stories to keep you interested in them a little bit, but mainly they're just there as tools to help you in combat scenarios. The maps were fun to explore, but kind of do feel a bit of the same. A lot of the areas do look very similar and do lend to being a bit of a slug later on, when you does feel like you're going through a bit of the same environments over and over. That being said, you are in arenas for the entire game, and they do embrace that, so you just kind of got to roll with it. I think a lot of the variety will come from the gameplay as opposed to the environments. The puzzles were really easy, but I do think that's a good thing because it doesn't slow the pacing down at all. Hard puzzles would have been a terrible choice in a game like this. These puzzles were really satisfying to solve. They used a little bit of your brain, but not too much to make it unsatisfying or unfun, so I was really happy with the level of puzzles in this game. The gear and loot was satisfying to find and pick up. It directly ties into exploration. Everything you find in the world is something you can use on your characters, and the guns felt really good to use, so it was fun to find new guns that you can combine with other abilities. It really rewarded you for trying out different combinations of things, which I think is really fun. Overall, the game is very short. I completed almost everything in the game in less than 7 hours. It's not the best value if you're buying the game full price, but if you can pick it up on sale, I think it's a really fun blast over a couple sessions just to power through a really satisfying gore fest of a turn-based game. So those are the games I played in February. Let me know what you guys have been playing down in the comments section below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you beautiful people in the next video.